Morning, ladies. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is our continue this journey, a fun journey actually, Robe Talk series by hydraulic fracturing community from ARMA. It is our great pleasure today to have a distinguished speaker from John McLennan from University of Utah, with his colleague Pengju Xing, who just joined this Forge program at the EGI, Energy and Geoscience Institute. The title of today's talk is using flowback and temperature for closure stress diagnosis. Before the talk, I'd like to emphasize the safety is always, that's the whole reason we're doing this series, is to connect, engage, and in turn, the professionals, especially geomechanics specialists around the globe during this pandemic situation. As we are facing these unprecedented challenges, as there's so many dynamic things going on. We were joking Houston get probably special treatment this year. Besides pandemic, we have industry downturn, a lot of layoffs in the town. And then we have this hurricane season starting the past weekend. And then you have this demonstration going on all over places. So safety always the first, social distancing always important, especially when these people start going out. Wearing masks that become a norm, become fashion actually. If you wear a mask, you show the concern not only for yourself, but also for people around you. So when you go out, wear a mask. So that's the safety moment of the day. But at the same time, we are having a lot of fun, especially those Robe Talks. I like to thank all the previous speakers. I see a lot of them in the chat in today's talk. Sid Green, Gary Couple, and Mark Zoback, Andy Bunger, many of them. Anthony Pierce, welcome on board, and Branko. A lot of them are here. So we are grateful for those great speakers. At the same time, we are more grateful for participants. It is your company that make this talk more enjoyable. And your questions are very inspiring too. So today's talk, as normal, we're going to have all the questions typed into the chat window. Feel free to ask as speaker goes through their slides. We have 45 minutes, but if we're running out of time, we can, you may actually continue the dialogue with the presenters in the email newsletter I'm going to send out in the weekend. You will see their email address. So feel free to reach out. Like I said, today the talk is using flowback and the temperature. That's interesting. To estimate the closure stress, which is always one of the hottest topic at a forge. The forge, and I think all of you know Forge probably. It's $140 million project for geothermal project, sponsored by DOE. And John McLennan is one of the principal investigators, along with his other colleagues from EGI. John has been well known. I don't think I need to introduce him too much, but he was the ARMA president. He mentored so many people, including myself, into this geomechanics community. John actually, proudly, he is a Canadian. not because I'm a Canadian too. So he graduated from University of Toronto. He has a strong Canadian accent. Not just kidding, John. But he worked quite a bit in the industry before he moved to academia. And now he's leading this $140 million project on geothermal. Very active in both geothermal as well as unconventional and petroleum especially. But now he's sitting in the civil engineering department. I don't know how that works out for you, John. But Dr. Pengju Xing is actually graduated from University of Pittsburgh. So Pengju, you must be Andy's student. Andy, you are not only doing a fantastic research, but also you're producing a lot of good students. I put this way, okay? Thank you for the efforts. So Pengju is recently joined University of Utah Forge project, and he used to work with Van Goten Laboratory after his PhD with Andy, University of Pittsburgh. So with that, the mic is yours, and John, Pengju, feel free to take over. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. This is John. I'd like to thank Gong for that extensive introduction, and since it was so extensive, we may have to go straight to questions now. However, I'm to be more serious. Gong has also described some of the characteristics of this presentation. First of all, it is about FORGE. FORGE is an acronym that stands for Frontier Observatory for Research in Engineering. And it's a program that's provided the opportunity to develop a pilot enhanced geothermal system, and along the way do some research. And I think that that's the important part of this presentation, that we'd like to talk about some closure stress analyses that are a little different than what are conventional. And they're not original. For example, Flowback, I believe Professor Solomon, who's on the call, published on Flowback probably almost 30 years ago. I don't know whether Dr. Savitsky or Dr. Dudley are on the phone, but they've published on it as well. But we just want to present some techniques that are a little different and get us all thinking about new ways that we might look at closure stress. And temperature. We've also had an opportunity, seeing as it's a geothermal well, to measure bottom hole temperature in conjunction with bottom hole pressure during injection. Next, please. As I mentioned, this is a Department of Energy project, and we're very grateful for that project. We're grateful to the Geothermal Technologies Office at the Department of Energy, and we've had fantastic support from private institutions who have land that we're using, and state lands and county as well within Utah. Next, please. So. With the preliminaries out of the way, let's talk a little bit about FORGE. And I'm going to make this very brief so that we can move on to Pengju. So at FORGE, basically we're setting up a field laboratory. And the field laboratory initially will constitute a number of shallow and deep monitoring wells that I'm not showing here, and two extended laterals. At an inclination of 65 degrees to the vertical. So the principle of FORGE in setting up this laboratory is to first drill an injection well, which is the lower well shown in blue. At the toe of that well, we will create 3 moderately sized hydraulic fractures and monitor those fractures for microseismicity. So the role of the microseismicity, of course, is to designate an approximate zone for where wet and dry events have occurred, so that you can drill subsequently the red well to intersect that zone of fracturing. So what you've set up here now, you have an injection well shown in blue. You have a heat exchange system shown by the hydraulic fractures, and you have a production well shown in red. And in theory, that is what happens at an EGS system, is that you're using this heat exchange system. You are adding fractures and adding fluid to a system that has temperature. So this is the difference between a conventional hydrothermal geothermal system, which already has those three elements. A conventional system has temperature, it has fluid, and it has fractures. Here, you've only got temperature, and you're adding the other two elements. Next slide. In a commercial setting, or an envisioned commercial setting, you would stimulate along the entire length of the well, as has been demonstrated in conventional oil and gas or unconventional oil and gas operations. And you would create a heat exchange system. There are obviously accompanying difficulties in terms of the distribution of heat or whatever, but in that system, you would circulate cold water, bring heated water to the surface, run that water, either flash it to steam or run it through a binary plant and generate electricity. You'll notice in the forge system that much of the lateral is open. And the purpose of that is that the Department of Energy will issue and has issued research solicitations for companies, individuals, institutions, or whatever, to use portions of that well to test out new fracturing technologies, stimulation technologies, isolation technologies, logging technologies at temperature and pressure. Next. And so I'm going to leave it there for the time being. I'll come back at the end and tell you a little bit about what's going forward in Forge. But I think the heart of this talk is looking at new ways to measure stress.
Okay. So can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. So as John introduced Utah Forge. So the Utah Forge site is in the south of Utah, 200 miles south of Salt Lake City. So there's so 5832 is a pilot well for testing and monitoring. It's drilled to 7,536 feet and penetrating more than 4,500 feet of granite. So there already been a lot of injection activities have been done in the well 5832. So there are 3 zones here, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. So in 2017, 8 injection cycles were carried out in zone 1. And in 2019, up to 9 injection cycles were carried out in each of the 3 zones. So in 19, there are 3 zones being treated. So these injection include micro hydrofracturing, defeat, step rate, step down, and pumping flowback tests. So zone 1 is at the toe. It's an open hole with 147 feet. And zone 2 is above zone 1, so it's cased and perforated. It says abundance of natural fractures. And zone 3 is also cased and perforated, but different from zone 2, it has very few fractures. So here's the details of the injection activities. So here, this is zone 1 during 2017. There are 8 injection cycles. So there are several, like 2, 3, 4. They are micro hydrofracturing with smaller rate and smaller volume. And 5 and 8, 5 and 8 are defeat with a higher rate and bigger volume. And some and 7 is separate. And some of these are like with extend shut-in, like 5 and in this in 2017, all are extend shut-in. And this still zone 1, but in 2019, so it's retreated. It has 9 cycles. Similar, it has several cycles of micro hydrofracturing and several cycles of defeat and 1 step rate. And also at 2019, we add flowback. So some cycles like cycle 5, so the operate is, so the flowback is operated after a little bit time of shut-in. And also with cycle 7 and cycle 8. And this is zone 2 during 2019. We also have 9 cycles. So also we have like microfracturing and defeat. We also have extend shut-in and flowback. Yeah, so there's a lot of injection activities and a lot of data we have. So here I will show you a brief summary of the stress gradient we inferred from the extend shut-in and stability test. So with different methods like G function, ISIP, reopening pressure, diagnostic log plot, etc. So each of these bars shows one interpretation. So 2A and 2B. So one cycle, if we use different methods, then we have multiple interpretations. So for example, the 2A, 2B is 2 different methods of interpret the cycle 2 during 2017. So then we put them together, so we can see the range. So from zone 1 is from 0.67 to 0.83, and zone 2 is from 0.76 to 0.95 psi per foot. So, and we don't have any interpretation from zone 3 because there's no fractures or open or reopen. So from this result, we can see that this apparently the interpretation from zone 2 is higher than zone 1. So let's say like inferred apparent stress gradient in zone 2 are greater than in zone 1. So we think the higher stress gradient in zone 2 could be caused by the neo variable tutorial state, and the generated or mobilized fracture may be not perpendicular to sigma-h mean. Although we found that it is affected by the pumping rate and volume. So you have a higher pumping rate and volume, then you have probably have a higher coil stress. And this could be due to by the backstress of pro-elasticity associated with the pressurization of the proximal fractures. So this is what we observed from the, like we call it, conventional measurements. And we also have, so today we will talk more about the alternative stress measurement techniques. So first one is pumping flowback test, and second one is temperature signature. So we try to use the temperature data to interpret the stress, closure stress. So the flowback, so as I showed before, so we have both pumping shut-in and pumping flowback tests carried out in each of 3 zones. So the flowback provides an alternative mechanism for assessing field stress, system transmissibility, and an index for evaluating fracture surface area and fracture complexity. Flowback, so the advantage of flowback is it offers short shut-in. So compared to shut-in, it have a very short time to closure. So reduce the operation time. So talking about flowback methods, there are 2 methods. So the left one shows the constant rate, and right is controlled choke size. So in left, the flowback rate is fixed, and so the pressure will drop. And so then you stop the flowback, then the pressure will rebound. So the So ABC are inflection points, and people use these inflection points to infer the collier stress. And so the control choke size is, instead of control the flowback rate. So controlling the flowback rate is difficult in operation. So instead, control flow rate, you fix the choke size constant. Then you do the small subcycle. So in some small subcycle, you start flowback and stop, and then wait for a short time and start flowback again, and then stop it. So you have a lot of small subcycles. Then you plot the pressure return volume, and so Savitsky and Dudley, they propose they pick this point as a collier stress. So here's a hypothesis. So the flux volume is related to like after so both the flowback rate and leak off. And since we assume that the flowback rate is much greater than leak off, so then your flux volume is like approximately related to just to the flowback. Then we have this relation. So the pressure, the derivative pressure over derivative flowback volume is equal to the system stiffness. And system stiffness can be expressed as this. So the CW is wearable storage coefficient, and this is the stiffness of the fracture. So the stiffness, the system stiffness will increase with the fracture mechanical closure during the flowback. And then, so the stiffness, system stiffness after closure should be constant and close to stiffness during the injection, because at the end, this number will be close to 0. So this stiffness should be close to the injection stiffness at the beginning. So to the injection data of the forge, we have like 5 cycles in zone 1, 5 cycles in zone 2. We have flowback test. And we find that not every flowback test is valid for collier stress interpretation, because sometimes we start the flowback too late. For example, for the left one, the flowback initiated here, it seems that this point, the pressure is low, very low, and this is already, the fracture already closed. So it just makes it very difficult to infer the collier stress. On the right, so the flowback started early. So we start from here, and then we change. So here is details. So this is zone 2, cycle 9, and so the injection, the maximum. So we start injection. The maximum rate is 15 barrels per minute. Then we shut in and wait for 30 minutes. Then the flowback initiated, and so we have 4 increment of the choke size. So we start from 1/64 inch, and then at this point change to 2/64. Then we keep it 2/64 until this point. Then we continue to change until then we fully open the choke. And finally, the 90 barrel recovered out of 188 barrel pumped. So here we plot a pressure versus the return volume, and we see the yellow curve is the data, the pressure, surface pressure with the volume. So it's very curvy. Sound like we have so we should have a smaller duration. But anyway, so we plot a polynomial fitting here, and it's bilinear. So we get this intersection of these two lines, and it's around 15 psi. It's surface pressure, and inferred stress gradient is around 0.65. So here I break into into the look at details of the subcycles. So there are 7 subcycles. So 7 of the flowback shutting cycles. Look at each one of them and plot the pressure with return volume. And we can see that the stiffness keep increasing from the first subcycle to the 7th. And we see, so there's a profound stiffness change between the subcycle 2 and subcycle 3, in 2 and 3, and which indicates the occurrence of flow fracture closure. Also, we also plot initial stiffness of the final subcycle. We plot the surface over the injection volume, so we get the stiffness during the injection, and this is very close. So this number is very close to the initial stiffness of last cycle. So we try to compare the flowback interpretation to the G function interpretation. So there's another cycle from zone 2, cycle 4. So we use G function, and we have a number like 0.86. So for comparison, so for the flowback, well, the stress gradient we get is 0.65 to 0.68. And for the Xing shutting, we get is 0.76 to 0.95. So it's quite, so the flowback interpretation is quite lower than the Xing shutting. So the question is an artificial gradient being picked since the flowback starts kind of late, or does flowback offer a very useful method for the closure stress interpretation in naturally fractured reservoirs? But so, however, we see the similar low values in the Xing shutting test in zone 1 in 2017. So there's a lot of questions here, but there's some lesson learned. So we should have smaller duration of flowback shutting cycles with smaller choke size, and also we should start flowback as soon as feasible after shutting. So next, I will talk about the interpretation from the temperature signatures. Because Forge is enhanced geothermal system, the cool water is injected, and that's so there's a lot of temperature changed during the hydrofracturing, during the testing. So here we look at some equations. So this is the heat transfer equation. We both have convection and conduction. And if we we have only the convection, we can reduce the equation to these. So the hypothesis is that this is one cycle from 2017. So the blue is the pressure data, and this red or orange is the temperature data. So we break this process into 3 stages. stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. So in stage 1, so it's before the pressure open or reopen. In this stage, assume that this heat conduction dominates, so the temperature will increase because it is heated by the formation. And in stage 2, it's after the fracture open, but before the fracture close, so it's when the fracture is open. And here, assume is the heat convection dominates and the temperature decrease. And stage 3, it is after the fresh closure. Then the heat conduction dominates and temperature will decrease, but finally it will increase. It will gradually change to increase trend. So, and with here we assume that the leak-off is Carter's leak-off. And then, so we assume the velocity in the heat convection here is same to the Carter leak-off. And finally, we got this, so this equation. And A is initial temperature gradient. And we also know that the pressure after shutting can be expressed as this. So I think we are familiar that this is this from the pressure data. This is noticed G function. So they have a very similar form. So similar, so we can borrow the things from the G function. So to the point that deviate from the linear section in the curve T dt dg versus G is the time when the pressure close. So the technique is quite straightforward. It's just similar to the pressure G function. So you plot the T dt dg and T dt dg versus G. So everything similar is here, except you use a temperature data. And you find the point that deviates from the linear section in the curve. And this, and this the pressure corresponding, so the pressure corresponding point for step 2 is the closure pressure. So here I will show some case studies. So here's the Zone 1 Cycle 3, 2017. So here is the pressure temperature data, and here, so the top is the temperature versus G, and the bottom is the pressure versus G. So here, this is the blue is the bottom hole temperature, and this is the dt dg, and this is the G dt dg. So here, find this point is this one is the section that is it's a deviates from the linear section, and from the point it is the time when the pressure close. So we find the corresponding pressure, and this is the closure pressure. So then we compare it to other methods. So from the temperature G, we get 0.66 PSI per foot, and from reopen pressure and SIP, it's 0.69, 0.71. So they are quite close. And I'll show more cases. So there's another case. Still, you have plot this temperature versus G and pressure versus G. So here from this point, and you get the interpretation results. I think they're very close to other methods. As another case, one more case. Yeah. Okay, so because we in the hypothesis we see that in the fracture, when the fracture open, so before the fracture close, it's the heat convection dominates. So let's go back to this equation to try to verify that. So the heat transfer equation can be simpler as this. So this is the convection term, and this is conduction. And if we utilizing the characteristic of velocity and the length, we substitute back into this equation. And so we got these, and let's say we compare the term of the heat convection and term of heat conduction, and we see a ratio of these two. If the ratio is very high, then we are confident that the convection is dominated before the fracture close. And here, so after all these, we substituting all these parameters in, we get feed is 5.7. I think we can say that this heat convection is dominant before fracture closure in stage 2. So this is verifying our hypothesis. So the conclusion is that color stress interpretation will carry out with both conventional methods and other methods, including pumping, flowback tests, and temperature signature analysis. Flowback seems to be a very promising methodology with significant operation autonomy in terms of time, and we learned some lessons from these flowback, and we'll improve our operation next time. For the temperature G function method, it has non-ambiguous feature for the color picking, and the results are very consistent with other methods like pressure G function, room pressure, and SSP and stability test. So that's what I have. John, do you want to continue? John?
If you can go to the next slide, please.
Okay.
So, what you can see is that we haven't solved all the problems, but what we've tried to do is point out some new possibilities for stress interpretation that we hope will get people thinking, and we're going to continue to use these methods of stress interpretation as we move ahead in the upcoming activities at Forge. And the upcoming activities at Forge will be probably in mid-August. We will spud the first extended lateral well and drill that ahead to a bottom hole temperature of about 235 degrees. Measured depth of almost 11,000 feet and true vertical depth of about 8,500 feet at the toe. This well will be cased and cemented and perforated. Just as a matter of interest, the photograph at right was taken at Fenton Hill in December 1983, where hydraulic stimulation was used to in one of the first EGS pilots that was in the first EGS pilot that was carried out. Next, please. So fundamentally, what we're going to see is that we will drill a horizontal well, and you can see the dashed line showing a horizontal completion. This is, as you can see, this is looking to the west. The 5832 is the vertical well that Pengju was talking about, where these measurements were carried out. And in answer to one of the questions, I think it's by Mahdi, these measurements that he's describing were done in a vertical well. And the zone 1 was barefoot, that was open hole. And zone 2 was a cased and cemented zone. And one of the reasons that these were done is that the geothermal community had not previously, or if they had, it wasn't advertised, treated through perforations. And so what was noticed in zone 1, which was a zone with a moderate number of fractures identified by image logging, that it was possible to break down and propagate some sort of fracture system in that well. And so we will drill 65-degree inclined well, and there'll be multiple wells for monitoring microseismicity, both for a hazard and for fracture mapping. Next, please. And so fundamentally, it goes back to this diagram, and this is the azimuth shown on the right is not quite right. It's moved a little bit from that, but conceptually this applies. That the forge well, the blue pilot injection well will be drilled first. 3 fracs at the toe, likely slick water. 1 will be in a short barefoot section. The second one will be slick water in a cased and perforated section. And the third one is yet to be determined, whether it will be low rate to look at shear enhancement, or whether it will be a higher rate, high viscosity treatment following a large cool down pad. But nevertheless, it will leave a large part of this well open for research. And in the first well that we're going to drill starting in August, we will do 2 sets of stress measurements immediately in that well. One will be just past the build. That will be an open hole extended leak off test. And there will be a conventional defit with and without flowback at the toe of the fracture. And I think pretty much that's it. Let's see what's next. Yeah, and so what I just want to encourage and ask for are recommendations on technologies for inferring stress, and to use the information that we've got here. It's all publicly available. It's a fantastic platform for backing your personal theories on G-function interpretation, or looking for different methods for stress interpretation. Just before I sign off, I can answer some of the questions that I can see here. One of the questions was, what is the stress regime at the location? This is actually an ideal site for enhanced geothermal energy. One of the criteria, as I mentioned, is it needs to be a thermally conductive regime dominantly overall. Hydrothermal conventional geothermal regimes are naturally fractured, and heat is convected upwards in those. This is a situation where it is a conductive thermal regime, and over geologic time, heat is moved largely by conduction. As you can see, there's nothing much around it. Environmentally, it's a fantastic area. No wildlife substantially is threatened. We live with the antelope and the little wildlife that's there. But tectonically, what this is that this is in the basin and range setting, where it is an extensional environment. And so it's a normal stress environment. And FMI data strongly showed drilling induced or thermally induced fractures in this vertical well that we're looking at right here in this picture, that were about 25 degrees east of north, very, very consistently. So extensional regime. The microhydraulic fractures that were pumped, there was a question about that, what sort of volumes. So the microfracs were pumped, depending on the particular case, at anywhere from 1/2 to 1 to sometimes 2 barrels a minute, depending on what we were looking for and what sort of equipment we had on location. And it was a matter that the smallest amount of fluid that was possible, just to look for either breakdown or rollover, and a little bit of propagation after that. So it's less than maybe 10 barrels for a typical microfrac, whereas the defits went anywhere from conventional defits, where you're pumping you know, a few tens of barrels or less, to some where substantial amounts of fluid were pumped. There was a second question that was posed, was during flowback, is the surface pressure all the way back to zero? As you saw, yes, and my mistake in terms of doing these tests was not starting the flowback immediately. I was always kind of guessing that just start the flowback just before what I thought the closure stress was, but I was surprised. And so the recommendation is that if somebody is carrying this out, closely follow the recommendations that are shown in Savitsky and Dudley's publication, where they started the flowback early, and they opened and closed the choke on a more frequent basis than we did. So I think Pengju has really demonstrated that it's a feasible technique, but there's some things that one could try differently. And eventually we flowed back to zero, to surface pressure of zero. Even when we flowed back to surface pressure of zero, you'd leave it at zero, and because of heat up of these fluids and the complications of temperature, recall that in this well in particular, the bottom hole temperatures were 200 degrees C, that you were continually seeing a fluid come back to the surface, even after you had transiently reduced the pressure to zero at the surface. And one of the most interesting thing about the stress data, as Pengju pointed out, was that there is real demonstration of self-shadowing, or what I call self-shadowing, where the treating pressure is substantially impacted by the amount of fluid pumped. And unlike the original backstress of Cleary and Mike Cleary and Mike Smith and folks like this, this is a backstress that we attribute to inflating supplementary natural fractures and pushing in on the fracture. And then my friend Mahdi has asked a question about why we attribute the difference in pressure to tortuosity. Mahdi, those measurements were done in a vertical well, and the first set of measurements were done in a barefoot section. And it was very interesting in this barefoot section. The FMI showed pre-existing linear fractures offset by 180 degrees, running exactly in the direction that we were anticipating of the maximum principal stress. So relatively little difficulty in reopening those fractures. Whereas farther up the hole in what we call zone 1, it was a cased and perforated zone. And we had selected it because the FMI had suggested there were a moderate number of fractures, or at least features that were identifiable on the FMI that were intersecting in that zone, where we could optimize our chances of actually breaking down that formation. Even when we were doing that, there's a potential that we were opening natural fractures that were not completely favorably oriented with respect to the maximum principal stress. Pierre-Francois is asking how temperature was measured. Temperature was measured in the 2017 campaign with a pressure temperature bomb that was hung below, in a ported stinger hung below a mechanical packer that was set at the casing shoe, so that we would be injecting into the barefoot section of the well and measuring bottom hole temperature and pressure. We ran the same type of operation in 2019, but the devices regularly failed because of, largely because of sensitivity of the batteries to temperature. And what else have we got? Oh, Ahmed Sarouche, I'd be surprised if there wasn't a question from you, my friend. What is your benchmark for comparing the results and evaluating which method yield more realistic stress estimates? It's a pertinent question, and it remains a question. One of the complications is that you're seeing some of these measurements are relatively low in situ stress measurements, and there's a desire for people experienced in the unconventional domain to say that those numbers are too low. What you do find in many of these low formation pressure geothermal systems, and many of them are quite dry, is that and naturally fractures, is that you typically find pressures that are in that range. And measurements at Dixie Valley by Steve Hickman and Mark Zobak are also in that range. So there's low numbers and there's some higher numbers. And depending on your interpretation method, how you pick something on a G function, whether you go for reopening pressure, whatever, there are complications. And the metrics and the benchmarking still are not established. All we need to do, or all we can do, is keep all of these in mind. For example, when we're drilling these deeper wells, we're worried about the low potential stress gradients because of cementing and losing cement when we're cementing the casing in place. We're worried about the higher pressure gradients when we're trying to break down the formation. So we don't know what is the correct answer, to be quite honest, but we try and be consistent and try and make rational engineering judgments. Let's see, oh boy, gosh, there's a lot of questions. Let's see, who else? Ahmed, so we don't have a benchmark. Eddie, to add to Madi's question, what did wellbore logs show in terms of properties variation along measured depth? Okay, so the vertical well that was drilled went to about 7,500 feet. It was logged with a quad combo and a couple of FMI surveys. Very interesting about the FMI, as I mentioned, is that we would see lots of features, and some of those were apparently critically stressed. And as a matter of fact, picking the critically stressed ones was one of the criteria for selecting the first zone to perforate, so that we would have something that we could pressurize. The FMI log at the toe of the well before injection showed that there were drilling induced or thermally induced fractures, because you're cooling down the well bore with drilling mud, that were aligned in the anticipated maximum stress direction. The last cycle, in the first measurements that we did in 2017, we pumped 200 mesh as well to kind of prop those open. And actually you can see the increased opening after stimulation, because we ran a post-frac FMI log. That information is available and can be passed on. Overall, we did not, from sonic scanner data, we did not see substantial differences along the length of the wellbore from processed acoustic data. So Pengju, there's a question for you from Igor. I don't know whether you can see it or whether you'd like me to read it to you.
I can read it. Yes, Igor. So yes, the fluid velocity is not constant across fracture waves. But here, what I show that the plot here. So the plot here is I show is after shut-in. So this data start from the after shut-in. So the fracture is not propagating here. So in this plot, so it says after shut-in. So it's based on the Carter's leak-off. So we try to find out after shut-in when the fracture closed. So as long as the notice G function works, so this should also works here. This is basic assumption. Yeah, this is my answer.
There was a question posed where cores recovered. Cores were recovered from zones that were different from the zones that were stimulated. There was a question from Professor Zoback about an estimate of pore pressure. We estimated pore pressure from the extended shut-in, and we probably made it to pseudo-radial in some of these, and it turned out to be very close to hydrostatic. However, the overall porosity of these formations is very low. Also, as the well is shut in, the water level in the well comes close to the surface. So we're anticipating it's fairly close to a hydrostatic scenario. And Nicholas is asking me the question that I was hoping wouldn't be asked was, would you please comment on how SH max was determined at the forge site? We've used standard methods to try and interpret it from the Kirsch solution. There were no intelligible or recognizable breakouts in this rock, so we didn't have really the mechanism to interpret SH max. And so any recommendations on methodology for interpreting SH max, we would appreciate. Victor is asking, how much error should I expect when I apply closure press estimation using flowback technique in tight sands, permeability less than 1 millidarcy? Well, I should let Pengju answer that question, but I'll just take a stab at it. I think from the work that we've done, I'm not sure I'm ready to answer that question. I just like to say that it looks like it's a feasible technique. Mark's question: why aren't the wells deviated in the SH min direction so that the hydraulic fracture propagates perpendicular to the well path? Well, maybe I explained I poorly explained this, but the wells are deviated in close to the SH min direction. The maximum principal stress is about 25 degrees east of north on average from the drilling induced fractures, and the planned trajectory of this well is about 15 degrees south of east, so close to 90 degrees off. A little less than 90 degrees because we wanted to maximize the length within the lease space that we had. Andrew has a question for Pengju.
Let's go back to the equation. So the question is, I would think that fracture compliance in the dominator becomes much larger than the wellbore compliance, so that the lower system becomes close to zero. I think after the fresh close, this will go to zero. So the AF will go to zero. So then after the closure, the stiffness should be like dominated by a wellbore. Yeah. I think it's no problem here.
Okay.
Pengju, sorry, John interrupted as well. You can continue answer the questions after I briefly make an announcement for the next Robe talks next Wednesday, as to the folks still remain in the room. Thanks, great talks. Thoroughly enjoyed it. This is a fantastic, not only overview but also the details, technical innovations from the forge. Next Wednesday, we're going to have another sterling speaker, Alexei Savitsky from Shell. She will talk about the poroelastic nature of multi-stranded hydraulic fractures in heterogeneous unconventional rocks, basically from recent hydraulic fracturing test site. As a matter of fact, after Alex's talk, the following week, we're going to feature the hydraulic fracturing test site from Gas Technology Institute, Steve and Jordan. Stay tuned. But I turn back to John and Pengju, feel free to take advantage of this meeting room and answer the rest of the questions. For the rest of the folks, stay healthy, and we're going to see you next Wednesday. The meeting invite will be announced in the newsletter this Saturday. Just to pay attention. If you're not receiving any newsletter yet, send me email. I will add you to the email list. Before long, then John and Pengju, feel free to continue. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Gong. Cheng Ho had a question. The question was whether or not the two zones, the open hole zone, zone 1 and zone 2, which were vertically about 400 feet apart, whether the defit in zone 1 could have altered the minimum stress gradient in zone 2. Certainly it's possible, but my sense is that probably zone 2 was relatively pristine. And the reason I'm saying that is that this zone broke down like a very, very classical hydraulic fracturing. Very classic breakdown, substantial drop after the fracture had initiated and broken down and propagated lower. So I'm sensing that the defit didn't impact it, but certainly can't rule that out. Sherilyn, hi. Are you monitoring induced seismicity with a one well vertical array? In these particular cases, we had the deep well that was 7,500 feet deep. We had an offset well that was 3,200 feet deep, penetrating the granite. There's alluvium above the granite, but it penetrated the granite. And we had a string of geophones in that. We also had surface nodal networks and a relatively shallow well. Going forward, there's much more microseismic monitoring that is going to be put into place. One of the dominant goals here was to confirm that we could locate these events. We could detect the events. Location was more uncertain, to be quite honest, just because of some of the geometries of the wells. And in the production scenario, that will be improved. Hello, Andy Duncan. Do you anticipate obtaining post-frac images in the horizontal inclined wells also? We're hoping to. So as I said, this well will be cased and cemented, but the production section will be logged with quad combo and some sort of imaging tool. And it will be cored at the toe, reamed out, and then a defit done at the toe. And so we'll have a pre-frac defit, and I guess it just depends on what happens in the field. Budget, difficulties in drilling, bottom hole temperature, but we have in the plans now to do a repeat image log after the fracture. D, let's see. Did you find a good choke size for flowback that worked for your particular lithology? The smaller, the better. I mean, we started with 1/64th. Part of the problem was that I was involved and there probably wasn't enough patience applied to the scientific method. So I recommend it, be gentle, bring it back through a small choke. And keep the increments of opening and closing the choke relatively short. Let's see. Everything else. I think that's all the questions that I see. Maybe I've missed some, but if I have, please don't hesitate to contact Pengju and myself. I'm happy to comment on any of the general aspects of Forge, and Pengju is really the expert on these new technologies. Oh, okay, one more. Were any logs run in the high temperature well? Yes. quad combo. Schlumberger was the low bid, and they ran a sonic scanner in these wells, and we ran formation micro imager. We at the very end, after the fracturing, we were considering running a UBI, but the temperatures were too high and we were out of money. So sort of the facts of life intervened. But all of that information is publicly available. Question, did you have the experience to miss fracture closure due to the fast flowback? That's always a possibility. I think, as I mentioned, Marty, and it's mea culpa here, we probably should have started flowback sooner and smaller increments. And I think that's the message that I'd like to deliver here. Pengju, do you want to say anything to add to that?
So not this question. So there's people asking us for the publication. Yeah, for the flowback, we have a publication in the Stanford Geothermal workshop and also ARMA paper. But for the temperature, we have not published yet.
Unless there's any more questions, I think Andy, Andy and Gong, we're gonna sign out here and